Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
Colin woke up early as usual. The sun had just risen on the horizon, and the house was enveloped in a heavy silence. He shuffled into the kitchen, dragging his tired feet across the cold tile floor, preparing a strong cup of coffee in the hopes that the drink would dull the bitterness he had felt since his wife passed away. Will I ever find peace again? Colin wondered as he took his first sip. He felt frustrated, overwhelmed, and each little thing seemed like an unbearable burden pressing down on him. His mother, Mrs. Rose, came down the stairs slowly, hearing her son's familiar footsteps in the kitchen. She knew that any misstep could trigger Colin's temper, but he was calm at the moment. "Good morning, Colin," she said, trying to keep her voice gentle and hopeful. She understood that peaceful moments were rare and precious. Colin looked at his mother, his eyes tired and full of pain. "Good morning, Mom," he replied, attempting a smile. "Remember to do everything right at the bakery today. I don't want to get any more calls from customers about you." While Mrs. Rose prepared breakfast, Colin sat down at the table and observed his mother. "Since my wife died, everything's become difficult. I've had to work harder with more responsibilities, and now I have to take care of you, too," he said, feeling a wave of discomfort. "I just want you to understand the importance of the bakery. I can't have you driving away customers." The memory of his late wife was still a raw wound, and each day felt like a battle to maintain control. Later, when Mrs. Rose was ready to leave for the bakery, Colin called out to her again. "Mom, come here," he said with a stern voice, making Mrs. Rose tremble slightly. "I need you to understand this: if you do something wrong today, if you disrespect me or act inappropriately, there will be consequences. I'm not doing this out of malice, I want you to improve for the future. Do you understand?" Mrs. Rose nodded in silence, feeling a wave of fear and sadness. "I understand," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. At the bakery, Mrs. Rose did her best to focus on making delicious pastries for the customers, but her conversation with Colin lingered in her mind. She met her friend, Mrs. Duke, when she came to the bakery to visit, and they sat down together. "How are things at home?" Mrs. Duke asked, noticing the worried expression on Mrs. Rose's face. "My son is getting worse, Mrs. Duke. Ever since my husband died, he's been stressed about everything. This morning, he told me that if I made a mistake, he would punish me, and he's never spoken to me that way before. I'm scared," Mrs. Rose confessed, feeling tears well up in her eyes. Mrs. Duke took her friend's hand, trying to offer some comfort. "It will be okay, Mrs. Rose. I'm here for you. We'll get through this together," she said, trying to reassure her friend. By the end of the day, Mrs. Rose returned home with a heavy heart. Colin was in the living room reading a newspaper. "Mom, how was the bakery today?" he asked without looking up from the paper. "Good," Mrs. Rose answered, trying to keep her worry hidden. "Did you do everything right? There were no problems?" Colin pressed, now looking straight at her. "I did everything carefully, don't worry," Mrs. Rose replied, feeling a lump form in her throat. Colin sighed and returned to his paper, but Mrs. Rose knew he was watching her every move. Later that night, at dinner, Colin noticed Mrs. Rose seemed distracted. "What's wrong, Mom? Why are you so quiet?" he asked with a tone that mixed worry and irritation. Mrs. Rose hesitated before answering, knowing that any wrong word could provoke a negative reaction. "I'm just tired. It was exhausting at the bakery today," she said, trying to sound convincing. Colin frowned but said nothing, allowing an uncomfortable silence to settle over the table. After dinner, Colin sought out Mrs. Rose. "I need to talk to you," he said, his serious tone making Mrs. Rose's heart pound. "When I said there would be consequences, I meant that I will not tolerate disrespect or improper behavior. And to make sure you understand, I'm implementing a new rule. If you disrespect me, you won't be allowed to eat. And that starts now. At dinner, you were inattentive and disrespectful, so you won't eat or drink anything until morning. Do you understand? Mrs. Rose felt a wave of despair. But, Colin, I'm just tired. Please don't do this, she begged, feeling tears streaming down her face. Colin remained unmoved. I'm doing this for your benefit. You need to maintain a better attitude because I'm taking care of you every day. Mrs. Rose walked to her room, feeling frightened and helpless. How could Colin do this to me? I'm hungry and thirsty, and he thinks this is good for me, she thought, feeling a mixture of anger and fear. Determined not to let this pass, Mrs. Rose picked up her phone and began recording a video for her friend. Colin is punishing me by not allowing me to eat or drink. He says it's for my benefit, but I'm scared and don't know what to do. Please, tell me what I should do, Mrs. Rose said in a shaky voice, then sent the video to Mrs. Duke, hoping that something would change. That night, Mrs. Rose and Mrs. Duke spoke on the phone. Duke, did you see the video I sent? Mrs. Rose asked in a quiet voice so Colin wouldn't hear. Yes, Mrs. Rose, I saw it. I can't believe he's doing this to you. It's horrible. You need help, you can't keep living like this, Mrs. Duke replied, feeling a growing sense of helplessness. I know, Mrs. Duke, but I don't know what to do. I'm afraid things will get worse if I try to get help. And what if no one believes me? Mrs. Rose said with a voice full of despair. I believe you, Mrs. Rose. I'll show the video to my son, he'll know what to do. We'll help you, I promise, Mrs. Duke said, trying to instill a bit of hope in her friend. As the conversation continued, Mrs. Rose felt a mixture of fear and relief. I hope this will make a difference, Mrs. Duke. I don't know how much longer I can endure this. I'm too tired, hungry, and feeling as though I'm losing my strength. Thank you for being my friend and supporting me. I don't know what I'd do without you, Mrs. Rose said, breaking down into tears. We'll make it through, Mrs. Rose. Stay strong, I'm here for you, and I won't let you face this alone, Mrs. Duke replied, her voice resolute. That night passed slowly for Mrs. Rose, each moment feeling like a test. Will tomorrow be any different? Will someone help me? She wondered, staring up at the ceiling in her room. Fear of Colin and hope for a change wrestled within her as tears rolled down her cheeks. Mrs. Rose clung to Mrs. Duke's promise, hoping that the following day would bring a new chance for freedom. Mrs. Duke felt a mixture of fear and determination as she showed the video to her son. Son, you have to see this, she said, handing him her phone with trembling hands. Arturo watched the video with a look of displeasure. What is this, Mom? Why are you showing me these pointless things? Arturo asked in an irritated tone. This isn't pointless, son. Mrs. Rose is being mistreated by her son. He's withholding food as punishment. We need to do something, Mrs. Duke pleaded, feeling a tear threatening to fall. Arturo sighed, took the phone, and deleted the video with a quick tap. I don't have time for this, Mom. Focus on your own life and don't get involved in other people's issues. Don't spread things like this around, Arturo said, handing the phone back to Mrs. Duke and walking away without looking back. Mrs. Duke stood still for a moment, shocked and hurt by her son's indifference. How can he be so unfeeling? Mrs. Rose needs help, she thought, feeling anger and disappointment rise within her. Determined not to abandon Mrs. Rose, Mrs. Duke decided to take matters into her own hands. She learned how to create an anonymous social media account and uploaded the video Mrs. Rose had sent along with a plea for help. Please, someone help my friend. She's being abused by her son and urgently needs assistance, Mrs. Duke wrote, sending her message out into the world. 3 days passed since the video was posted, and the neighborhood was buzzing with comments about the situation. Mrs. Rose and Mrs. Duke met at the bakery, anxious and tense. Have you seen the comments, Mrs. Duke? People are genuinely outraged. Maybe this will make a difference, Mrs. Rose said, trying to hold on to hope. Yes, I saw them. Many people are offering to help, Mrs. Duke replied, scanning their surroundings to make sure no one was eavesdropping. But we have to be cautious. We can't let your son find out that I'm the one who posted the video, she said, reading some of the comments quietly as they sat in a secluded corner of the bakery. Look at this, Mrs. Rose. This is unbelievable. Where are the authorities? She needs help immediately. And this one. Does anyone know this elderly lady? We need to find her and offer assistance, Mrs. Duke read, feeling a mix of hope and fear. People are truly concerned. But how can we ensure that the person who helps us is trustworthy? Mrs. Rose asked, still feeling uneasy. Meanwhile, in a small, organized office, Emma, a dedicated social worker, was reviewing some reports when a colleague, Miguel, walked into the room. Emma, you need to see this, he said, handing her a tablet with the video open. This is going viral on social media, and it looks like a serious matter. Emma took the tablet and started watching the video, feeling a wave of anger and sadness rise within her. This is unacceptable. We need to investigate immediately, she said with resolve. Familiar with dealing with difficult cases, Emma knew she had to act quickly. She created an anonymous account and sent a message to the account that posted the video. Hello, I'm a social worker, and I've seen the video you posted. I'd like to help, but I need more information. Could we talk? Emma wrote, hoping for a response. At the bakery, Mrs. Duke received the message and showed it to Mrs. Rose as soon as she could. Look, Mrs. Rose, someone claiming to be a social worker wants to help. What should we do? Mrs. Duke whispered, feeling her anxiety rise. Respond to her. Say we need help but don't reveal our names or address for now. We need to make sure this is safe, Mrs. Rose replied, trying to remain calm. Mrs. Duke replied to the message, explaining the situation generally without revealing specific details. Hello, we really appreciate your help. My friend is in a very difficult situation, but we're afraid to disclose our names and address at this time, she wrote, sending the message with a worried sigh. Emma read the message and understood the caution. I understand your concerns. We need to find a safe way to meet. Could you come to the Social Assistance Center? We have a team ready to help, Emma suggested, hoping they would trust her. Mrs. Duke read the message and exchanged a worried look with Mrs. Rose. We can't go there, Colin always picks me up at the bakery. He'll know if I disappear, Mrs. Rose said with a trembling voice. Mrs. Duke quickly replied. Unfortunately, we can't come to the Social Assistance Center. Her son keeps a very close watch. Could we meet somewhere else, she suggested, trying to find a solution. Emma understood the difficulty and offered an alternative. If you can't come here, we could meet at a nearby park. I can go there and speak with you discreetly. How do you feel about meeting tomorrow? Emma wrote, sensing the urgency of the situation. Mrs. Duke showed Mrs. Rose the message, and she nodded with a sigh of relief. It sounds like a good idea, but we need to be cautious. Let's arrange to meet her tomorrow, Mrs. Rose agreed. Mrs. Duke replied to the message, confirming the meeting for the next day at the park. We'll meet tomorrow at the park. We'll be at the back of the park near the large tree. Please be discreet, she wrote. The following day, Mrs. Rose and Mrs. Duke felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation as they awaited the meeting with Emma. All day, they were filled with tension, hoping everything would go smoothly. But in the middle of the day at the bakery, something unexpected happened. Colin arrived at the bakery earlier than usual and walked straight in. Mom, let's go. We have to leave now. We're going to the next city to learn baking techniques from an expert. So, you're coming with me, Colin said in a tone that left no room for objection. Mrs. Rose looked at Mrs. Duke, her eyes filled with panic and fear. But Colin, I have plans with my friend, Mrs. Rose tried to explain, but Colin interrupted her. There's no time for that. Let's go, grab your things, he ordered, pulling her along. As Colin dragged Mrs. Rose away, Mrs. Duke stood there, unsure of what to do. Her plan was falling apart, and help was almost within reach but now seemed impossible to grasp. What should I do now? How can I inform Emma? Mrs. Duke thought, feeling the pressure mounting. She knew she needed to act quickly but was left without options. Colin led Mrs. Rose out of the bakery as Mrs. Duke, filled with fear and uncertainty, tried to think of a way to save her friend. In a state of worry and fear, she made her way to meet Emma. She didn't know what would happen, but she knew she had to do something to help Mrs. Rose. Sitting alone on a bench in the park with her heart racing, she waited for the social worker to arrive. I hope she can really help us, Mrs. Duke thought, anxiously looking around. Emma arrived with a look of determination, recognizing Mrs. Duke from afar and approaching her with a welcoming smile but a serious expression. Thank you for watching the video all the way through. You are our biggest motivation to keep creating. Let us know where you're watching from so we can see how far this video has reached around the world. Don't forget to hit like if you found it interesting, and share it with your friends too. Hello, Mrs. Duke. I'm Emma, I'm here to help. Please, tell me everything that's going on, she said, sitting down beside Mrs. Duke. Mrs. Duke took a deep breath before beginning. My friend, Mrs. Rose, is in a very difficult situation. Her son, Colin, is very controlling and treats her poorly when she does anything he doesn't like. He's withheld food and water from her for days. I posted the video she sent me because I didn't know what else to do, Mrs. Duke explained, feeling a weight lifted as she shared the issue. Emma listened intently, taking notes in her notebook. I understand, Mrs. Duke. You did the right thing by seeking help. I need to know where Mrs. Rose is now and how I can contact her if I need more information, Emma asked, trying to gather as much information as possible. Mrs. Duke provided her address and phone number, explaining that Colin and Mrs. Rose had gone to a nearby city, and she didn't know when they would return. I'm very worried about her, Mrs. Duke said, her eyes filled with tears. Emma recorded all the information and promised to take action. We'll do everything we can to help Mrs. Rose. I'll speak to the shelter coordinator, Miguel, and we'll make a plan. Thank you for your bravery, Mrs. Duke. You're a wonderful friend, Emma said, holding Mrs. Duke's hand firmly before departing. Back at the office, Emma met with Miguel, who was reviewing some reports. Miguel, we need to talk. I have an emergency case, Emma said, walking in quickly. Miguel looked up, recognizing the urgency in Emma's voice. All right, Emma. What happened? Is it about the video I showed you? He asked, signaling for her to sit down. Emma explained the entire situation with Mrs. Rose and Colin, including the video, her conversation with Mrs. Duke, and their sudden departure from the city. We need to take action, Miguel, but unfortunately, they're out of town, and we don't know when they'll return. We have to be ready when they do, Emma concluded, her eyes determined. Miguel nodded, fully grasping the severity of the situation. I agree, Emma. We'll monitor the situation and be prepared to intervene as soon as they're back. I'll mobilize our team and make sure we're ready for anything, he said, already planning their next steps. Days turned into weeks, and there was still no sign of Colin and Mrs. Rose. With each passing day, Emma and Mrs. Duke's worry grew. Emma decided to reach out to Mrs. Duke for any updates. She picked up the phone and dialed the number Mrs. Duke had provided. On the other end, it wasn't Mrs. Duke who answered but her son, Arturo, speaking in a grumpy tone. Who is this? Arturo asked impatiently. Hello, my name is Emma. I'm a social worker trying to help an elderly woman named Mrs. Duke and her friend, Mrs. Rose. Can we talk? Emma tried to remain calm, realizing someone else had answered. Arturo didn't give Emma a chance to explain. I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't have time for this, he said, cutting the conversation short. Just then, Mrs. Duke arrived in time to hear part of the conversation and quickly grabbed the phone from her son's hand. "Son, please let me speak to her." "Trust me," Mrs. Duke said, looking directly into Arturo's eyes. Arturo hesitated but eventually handed the phone to her, confused about what was happening. "I'm sorry, Emma, it's me, Duke. My son didn't know what was going on. Mrs. Rose still hasn't returned, but I think she might come to the bakery tomorrow because Saturdays are typically very busy with orders we can't miss. But she hasn't replied to any of my messages." "Her son must have confiscated her phone," Mrs. Duke explained, feeling relieved to hear Emma's voice. "I understand, Mrs. Duke. I'll be ready to take action as soon as possible. Please keep me updated on any changes." "Thank you for trusting me," Emma replied, feeling the urgency of the situation building. The next day, Mrs. Duke anxiously waited for Mrs. Rose at the bakery. When she finally saw her friend, her heart nearly stopped. Mrs. Rose looked frail, pale, and visibly exhausted. "Mrs. Rose, are you okay?" "What happened?" she asked, embracing her friend tightly. Mrs. Rose looked at her with sad eyes. "It was terrible, Mrs. Duke. My son left me without food and water for days. He said it was to teach me how to behave. I wanted to come back, but he wouldn't let me. It was a nightmare," Mrs. Rose shared, her voice choked with emotion. Mrs. Duke felt a wave of anger and worry. "Mrs. Rose, this can't go on. We need to tell Emma. She can help us," she said, holding Mrs. Rose's hands. Mrs. Rose shook her head in despair. "No, Mrs. Duke, it will only make things worse. My son might find out and do something even worse. Please don't tell Emma anything more." "I can't risk it," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Duke looked at her friend, torn between wanting to help and fearing to make the situation worse. "I promise I won't say anything more to Emma, Mrs. Rose. But if things get too bad, we'll have to find another way to get help," she said, trying to reassure her friend. With that promise, the two women continued baking for the customers, carrying the heavy burden of a secret that could change their lives. Mrs. Duke knew that the situation was far from resolved, but for now, all she could do was support Mrs. Rose in the best way possible. She sat at the kitchen table, her mind racing with thoughts while her son, Arturo, watched TV nearby. After seeing Mrs. Rose's state at the bakery, she knew she had to do something, but how could she explain everything to her son, who until now seemed entirely unaware? "Son, can I talk to you?" Mrs. Duke asked, her voice trembling. Arturo looked at her, recognizing the seriousness in her tone. "All right, Mom. What's going on?" he replied, sitting down beside her. Mrs. Duke took a deep breath before she began. "Son, I need to tell you something very important about Mrs. Rose. Her son, Colin, is mistreating her. He left her without food and water for days in another city. She's been suffering terribly, and I don't know what else to do. I learned to make an account and posted that video I showed you before on social media because I didn't know any other way to help her," she said, tears streaming down her face. Arturo was silent for a moment, processing the information. "I didn't realize it was that serious. I'm sorry for not listening to you earlier. You did everything you could to help your friend, and I'm sorry I didn't see how much it was affecting you," Arturo said, hugging his mother tightly. "What can we do now to help Mrs. Rose?" he asked, a look of determination in his eyes. Mrs. Duke wiped her tears and looked at her son with hope. "We could call Emma, the social worker. She's been trying to help us before. If you call, she'll believe us, and she might be able to do something to save Mrs. Rose," she suggested, feeling a weight lifted now that her son finally understood the gravity of the situation. That night, Arturo took his mother's phone and called Emma. "Hello, Emma, this is Arturo, Mrs. Duke's son. I apologize for not understanding the situation before. I need to talk to you about Mrs. Rose. She just returned from a trip with her son, but she's in terrible condition. What can we do to help her? Arturo said, his voice full of concern. Emma sensed the urgency in his voice and responded with determination. Thank you for reaching out, Arturo. I understand the situation, and will do everything we can to help Mrs. Rose. I'll coordinate with the necessary services to intervene and ensure her safety. Please keep me updated on any changes, Emma said, preparing to take action to protect Mrs. Rose. The next day, Emma and Miguel arrived at the bakery. Colin was waiting for Mrs. Rose at the entrance, but Emma and Miguel approached him directly. Mr. Colin, we need to talk. We've received very serious allegations about how you've been treating your mother. Mrs. Rose will be temporarily under our care while we investigate these claims, Emma said with a firm tone. Colin looked at Emma with anger and disbelief. What are you talking about? I'm Mrs. Rose's son, and no one has the right to take my mother from me, he shouted, moving towards Mrs. Rose. Miguel stepped in, positioning himself between Colin and Mrs. Rose. Mr. Colin, please remain calm. We're here to ensure Mrs. Rose's safety. If you don't cooperate, things will only get worse for everyone, Miguel said in a calm voice. Mrs. Rose, frightened, was escorted by Emma into the car. Everything will be okay, Mrs. Rose. We'll take care of you, Emma reassured her. At the support center, Mrs. Rose was welcomed with warmth and compassion. You're safe here, Mrs. Rose. We'll take care of you and ensure nothing bad happens to you, Miguel said as she was led to a cozy room. Meanwhile, Mrs. Duke worried about Mrs. Rose, wondering how her friend was adjusting to her new environment. I hope Mrs. Rose is all right. She's been through so much, she thought, gazing out the window, hoping that her friend would make an appearance in her life again soon. Mrs. Rose returned to school, but this time, Emma accompanied her. You'll be okay, Mrs. Rose, I'll always be close by, Emma assured her as they walked down the hallway. Colin had tried to approach Mrs. Rose at the gate, but Emma intervened just in time. Mr. Colin, please keep your distance. Mrs. Rose is under our protection, and any attempts to make direct contact will be considered a violation of the protective measures, Emma said with authority. Colin attempted to argue. She's my mother. I have the right to speak with her, he shouted, but Emma calmly held her ground. We're investigating these allegations, Mr. Colin. Until everything is clarified, we need to ensure Mrs. Rose's safety, Emma stated firmly. Emma took Mrs. Rose to a nearby tea shop, trying to create a relaxed environment for her to speak openly. Mrs. Rose, I know this is very difficult, but we need to understand what happened. Can you tell me more about what your son has done? Emma asked gently. Mrs. Rose stared at the tea in front of her, feeling uneasy. I don't know if I can. My son said it was all for my benefit. He cares about me and only wants me to do better for the bakery. Maybe I exaggerated, she said, trying to justify what she had previously shared. Perhaps I was wrong, Emma. I don't want to cause trouble. Sensing Mrs. Rose's difficulty in opening up, Emma decided not to push her. It's okay, Mrs. Rose. I know this is challenging. We'll return to the center and talk more when you feel ready. The most important thing is that you feel safe and comfortable, Emma said with a reassuring smile. They returned to the support center, Emma holding Mrs. Rose's hand to ensure she felt supported. We're here for you, Mrs. Rose. No matter how long it takes, we'll find a way to resolve this, Emma promised as they walked back to the center. Reflecting on the day, Emma knew the road ahead would be long, but she was determined to help Mrs. Rose find the safety and happiness she deserved. I won't give up on you, Mrs. Rose. We'll get through this together, Emma thought as she prepared for what lay ahead. The following day, Emma felt anxious and exhausted. She knew Mrs. Rose was currently safe, but she couldn't ignore the possibility that Colin would claim his rights. Sitting in her small office at the support center, Emma flipped through files, searching for anything that could help keep Mrs. Rose away from Colin until the investigations were complete. She knew she needed concrete evidence. Miguel entered the room, sensing the tension on Emma's face. "Emma, without concrete evidence, we can't keep Mrs. Rose here. The law is clear on this. We'll have to return her to her son if we don't find anything specific," Miguel said regretfully. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. The thought of sending Mrs. Rose back to Colin without ensuring her safety was unacceptable. Desperate, Emma spent the night investigating but made little progress. Mrs. Rose continued to struggle with fully opening up. The conversations with Emma continued, but she would close off whenever the topic touched on the punishments she had endured. "It's as if there's a wall inside me that I can't break down," she thought, feeling frustrated with herself. One day, Mrs. Rose was encouraged to join an art activity at the support center. At first, she hesitated but soon found herself absorbed in the vibrant paintings and discovered a hidden talent she had never known. "I never thought I'd enjoy painting so much. My son never supported these things, he always said it was a waste of time," Mrs. Rose thought, feeling a new passion blossoming within her. Meanwhile, Colin was determined to regain custody of Mrs. Rose. He gathered documents and witnesses to support his argument and sought legal assistance to prove that, without concrete evidence of continuous abuse, Mrs. Rose should be returned to him. Colin still believed the accusations were unfair and that he was simply acting in his mother's best interest in the way he saw fit. A few days later, Colin appeared at the support center with his lawyer. Emma and Miguel were prepared to defend Mrs. Rose, but the lack of specific evidence made the situation more complicated. "Mr. Colin, we understand your perspective, but we need to ensure Mrs. Rose's safety. We're doing everything we can to reach a fair conclusion," Miguel said, trying to stay calm. "I'm her son, and I have the right to bring her home. Without evidence, you can't keep her here." "This is illegal," Colin argued with a determination that unsettled Mrs. Rose. After a lengthy discussion, the decision was made to return Mrs. Rose to Colin, a decision that Emma and Miguel had to accept with regret. Mrs. Rose was informed of the decision, and her heart sank. "I thought I was safe here. I don't want to go home with him," she said, bowing her head and crying. "Mrs. Rose, I'm so sorry. We'll continue to monitor your situation, and you can reach out to us at any time. We won't give up on you," Emma promised, her eyes brimming with tears. Back home, Colin attempted to resume a normal life with Mrs. Rose, but everything was far from normal. Colin was tense and frustrated, while Mrs. Rose walked on eggshells, terrified of making a mistake. One night, Mrs. Rose tried to prepare ingredients for the next day's bakery orders but struggled to focus. Colin noticed and, in a fit of anger, decided to punish her once again. "You should be more careful and focused, Mother. This time, I'll make sure you understand that," Colin said angrily. He deprived her of food and water for 2 days, a cruel punishment that Mrs. Rose endured silently with a broken spirit. "How could Colin do this to me? I thought he had changed," Mrs. Rose thought, feeling despair taking over her. The punishment eventually ended, but Mrs. Rose was weak and defeated. "I'll let you go out this time, but you need to be more careful and focused. I'm doing this for your benefit, Mrs. Rose," Colin said, unaware of the harm he was causing. Mrs. Rose looked at him with no energy left to respond, only hoping that it would all end. Meanwhile, the support center faced increasing financial difficulties. Emma worried about the center's finances but refrained from sharing this with Mrs. Rose and Mrs. Duke to avoid adding to their emotional burden. The center, already struggling financially, was now on the brink of collapse. The lack of government support was pushing it to a critical point. "We need to find a way to keep this place running, Miguel. These elderly people depend on us, and we can't let them down," Emma said anxiously as she reviewed financial documents in Miguel's office. "I know, Emma, but the numbers don't lie. We have fewer cases and high costs. We need an emergency income source or support," Miguel replied, sighing deeply. Despite the dire situation, Emma and Miguel continued their daily activities, striving to maintain a sense of normalcy for the elderly in their care. One day, they received an invitation to present at a public square in the city where Mrs. Rose lived, about the role of social workers and the importance of protecting the elderly. They saw this as an opportunity not only to raise awareness but also to bolster support for the center. On the day of the presentation, the hall was packed, with everyone eager to hear what Emma and Miguel had to say. "Good morning, everyone. My name is Emma, and this is Miguel. We work at the Social Support Center, and we're here to talk about the importance of protecting the elderly and ensuring everyone has a safe environment," Emma began, looking at the crowd with determination. "Sometimes, elderly people face difficult situations at home that aren't always visible. Our job is to make sure these elderly individuals are heard and protected. We want everyone to know they're not alone and that there is always help available," she continued, sensing the attention of the audience. Miguel continued. "It's important for everyone to be aware of the signs of abuse and neglect. If you know someone going through this, seek help. We are here to support and protect," he said with a serious tone, conveying the gravity of the work they do. At the back of the hall, Mrs. Rose listened to every word with full attention. Emma and Miguel's words struck her deeply, stirring memories of her own pain and the support she had received. Maybe it's time to tell everything, she thought, feeling a new wave of courage rising within her. After the presentation, Mrs. Rose approached Emma. "Emma, could I talk to you?" "I think I'm ready to tell everything," Mrs. Rose said with a determination Emma had never seen in her before. "Of course, Mrs. Rose. Let's go somewhere private where you can feel comfortable," Emma replied, leading Mrs. Rose to a quiet tea shop. Sitting across from each other, Emma looked into Mrs. Rose's eyes, waiting for her to feel safe. "Whenever you're ready, Mrs. Rose, I'm here to listen and help," Emma said softly, encouraging her. Mrs. Rose took a deep breath and began. "Ever since my daughter-in-law passed away, my son has changed so much. He's become tense and quick to anger. Any small mistake I make is a reason for him to punish me. Sometimes, he leaves me without food or water for days. When we went to the nearby city, he locked me in a storage room with no food because I asked to go back home. I was so scared and hungry, I just wanted it to stop," Mrs. Rose said, tears streaming down her face. Emma listened intently, recording important details. "Mrs. Rose, you're very brave for sharing all of this. Now we can take action and ensure your safety. We'll bring this to the authorities and make sure your son is held accountable," Emma said, holding Mrs. Rose's hand with determination. With Mrs. Rose's testimony, Emma and Miguel gathered enough evidence and brought the case to the authorities. Colin was temporarily detained as the investigation began. Emma felt relieved, knowing that Mrs. Rose was finally safe and that justice was being served. "You did the right thing, Mrs. Rose," Emma said, hugging her. While Mrs. Rose continued to live at the center, Emma and Miguel focused on gathering all the necessary evidence to ensure Colin would be punished for his actions. However, the looming shadow of bankruptcy hung over the center. Resources were depleting quickly, and Emma's worry grew each day. One afternoon, while Emma was reviewing financial documents with Miguel, the phone rang. It was one of the center's regular sponsors, notifying that he could no longer contribute due to his own financial difficulties. Emma felt a lump in her throat. "Miguel, I don't know how much longer we can keep the center running. Donations are dropping, and our costs are high," she said, her eyes filled with concern. Miguel nodded, sharing Emma's worry. "We need to find a quick solution. Maybe we should consider organizing a fundraising campaign or seeking government support. We can't abandon these elderly people," Miguel suggested, trying to hold on to hope. Meanwhile, Mrs. Rose was at the center, but her mind was constantly worried about the future. "If the center closes, where will I go?" she wondered. Emma's presence provided her some comfort, but the uncertainty about the future was overwhelming. Mrs. Duke noticed her friend's anxiety and tried to reassure her. "Mrs. Rose, you're safe now. I know things are difficult, but Emma and Miguel will do everything they can to help you. I'm here for you too, she said, hugging her friend tightly. Days passed, and the situation at the support center grew more severe. Emma and Miguel did everything they could to keep it running, but the lack of resources was an insurmountable obstacle. We need to do something fast, Miguel, Emma said with urgency. Miguel agreed, but he knew their options were running out. Maybe we can organize a fundraising event, something that involves the community and shows the importance of the work we're doing, but we need to act quickly, he proposed, feeling the pressure mounting. Emma began planning a fundraising event, calling for the involvement of local businesses and volunteers. If we can rally the community, maybe we'll have enough funds to keep the center running, Emma thought as she made phone calls and sent emails to potential sponsors. Meanwhile, the investigation into Colin continued. Mrs. Rose, though still fearful and hurt, received continuous support from Emma and the center's staff. You're very strong, Mrs. Rose. We're here for you and won't let anything bad happen to you, Emma said as she joined Mrs. Rose in the center's daily activities. However, the harsh reality continued to threaten them. The support center stood on the verge of closure, and the uncertainty about the future of its elderly residents weighed heavily. Emma and Miguel knew they needed a miracle to keep the center running, but they were determined to fight to the end. And so, while the investigation into Colin continued and Mrs. Rose worked to rebuild her life, the social support center faced its greatest challenge. The fight for justice and the future of the elderly was far from over, but Emma and Miguel remained steadfast in their mission, determined to do everything possible to protect those who needed it most. The news about the potential closure of the social support center left Mrs. Rose and Mrs. Duke deeply concerned. Determined to help, the two friends met to discuss fundraising ideas. Mrs. Duke, we can't let the center close. Emma and Miguel have done so much for us. We need to find a way to help, Mrs. Rose said, her eyes shining with resolve. Mrs. Duke nodded, feeling the same sense of urgency. I agree, Mrs. Rose. Maybe we could organize a community fundraiser. We could hold presentations, sell goods, anything to help raise funds, she suggested, beginning to jot down ideas in a notebook. The two friends spent the afternoon planning and decided to organize an event at the square featuring art displays, selling homemade treats and drinks, and a raffle with prizes sponsored by local merchants. We could do an art exhibit. Mrs. Rose, you not only make delicious pastries but also beautiful paintings. This could attract more people, Mrs. Duke suggested with excitement. Mrs. Rose smiled, feeling uplifted for the first time in days. I love that idea, Mrs. Duke. Let's make it happen, Mrs. Rose replied, envisioning the upcoming event. In the following days, Mrs. Rose and Mrs. Duke spoke with Arturo, Mrs. Duke's son. With his help, they started preparing for the event. The big day finally arrived. The hall was decorated with balloons and signs explaining the importance of the social support center. I hope a lot of people come, Mrs. Rose said, nervous. Everything will be fine, Mrs. Rose. We're doing this for a good cause, Mrs. Duke reassured her, trying to ease her friend's worries. The event was a huge success. The community came out in large numbers to support the cause. You two are amazing. I'm so grateful, Emma said, tears streaming down her face as she saw their efforts. You're making a difference. In addition to the beautiful artwork, the pastries Mrs. Rose made were also a big hit. The raffle attracted a lot of interest, and by the end of the day, both Mrs. Rose and Mrs. Duke were exhausted but happy. We raised more money than expected, Mrs. Duke said joyfully, counting the donations with excitement. This will help keep the center running for longer. The funds were handed over to Emma and Miguel, who couldn't hold back their emotions. Mrs. Rose and Mrs. Duke, you both saved the center. We don't know how to thank you enough, Miguel said with gratitude. Now, we can continue our work and protect more elderly people thanks to you. With the social support center secured, Emma focused on gathering the necessary testimonies for Mrs. Rose's case. We need your testimony, along with Mrs. Dukes and her sons, to strengthen the case against Colin, Emma explained. Are you all ready? Mrs. Rose and Mrs. Duke nodded, prepared to face this final step. We're ready, Emma. Let's do this, Mrs. Rose said with determination. My son and I will testify too, Mrs. Duke added. The testimonies were moving and detailed. Mrs. Rose recounted everything that had happened at Colin's hands, while Mrs. Duke and Arturo confirmed the authenticity of the events and spoke about the changes they had witnessed in Mrs. Rose. She was so frightened and frail when she returned from that trip. I've never seen anyone that scared, Arturo said compassionately. The testimonies were presented to the police commissioner, who listened to every word carefully. This is unacceptable. We'll ensure justice is served, the commissioner said firmly. Colin was held in jail while the investigation continued, based on solid evidence and testimonies. With Colin in prison, Mrs. Rose began to feel safer and more optimistic about a better future. Emma decided to take it a step further and proposed to take care of Mrs. Rose. Mrs. Rose, would you be my mother? Would you like to be part of my family? Emma asked, holding Mrs. Rose's hands. Overwhelmed, Mrs. Rose embraced Emma tightly. Yes, Emma. I would love to be part of your family. You saved me and brought me hope when I needed it most, Mrs. Rose said, tears of happiness streaming down her face. The guardianship was formalized, and Mrs. Rose moved in with Emma, forming a warm and loving family. Mrs. Duke remained a loyal friend, always by Mrs. Rose's side. We'll always be together, Mrs. Rose. I'll always be here for you, Mrs. Duke said. Inspired by the strength of Mrs. Rose and Mrs. Duke, Arturo became a more present and loving son. I promise to change and become the son you deserve, Arturo said, hugging his mother. Mrs. Duke smiled, feeling the love and support from her son. Miguel also became part of Mrs. Rose's new life, helping Emma care for her. You're part of our family now, Mrs. Rose. I'll be close by to help and make sure you have everything you need, Miguel said with a warm smile. Meanwhile, Colin, in prison, reflected on his actions. I've made so many mistakes, but I hope someday my mother can forgive me, he thought, filled with regret and disappointment. However, everyone knew that if he regained custody, he would likely return to his old behaviors. Mrs. Rose, finally feeling free and safe, knew she had found her true purpose and was determined to make a difference through her art and baking. Life returned to normal for Mrs. Rose, Mrs. Duke, and their family. The Social Support Center, now receiving more community support, continued to help other elderly people in similar situations. We're making a difference, Emma. Every day, we're saving more lives, Miguel said, feeling fulfilled. Mrs. Rose, now part of a loving family and supported by loyal friends, knew she had a happy life ahead. I'll never forget what I went through, but I know I'm safe and loved now. Thank you, Emma, for giving me a new chance, Mrs. Rose said as she walked beside Emma. The story of Mrs. Rose, Mrs. Duke, and everyone involved stands as a testament to the fact that with courage, love, and support, even the hardest challenges can be overcome, and new happiness can be found. And so, with hope rekindled and a peaceful life ahead, Mrs. Rose and her new family continued their journey together, united and stronger than ever.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.